Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 5 of my Wargaming Rules review series. In this video I'll provide an overview of the WRG Wargame Rules 1685 to 1845, dated or published dated July 1979. Unlike my other rules review, I'm going to cover a bit of the history and significance of this set of rules, as I feel this is one of the two bedrock set of rules which have been used by most Napoleonic gamers over the last 50 years, even if they may not be aware of it today. This is one of the first set of Napoleonic rules which used a sequential sequence of play rather than a simultaneous sequence of play. The notes indicate this was based on the system used in the WRG Micro Armor rules. The rules are still available via Lulu, although the version shown here is a special edition printed back in July 1979. To the best of my knowledge, they are the same rules. These rules have been astoundingly successful and are still being used today, mainly with 25mm, but also a reasonable amount of 15mm players as well. The separate army lists are reasonably good if simple, and as long as you use the army lists and keep the size of each forces to about 50 elements per side, it gives you a reasonable game. The main issue is the game turn scale, which means there is little to no manoeuvring before any battle. I feel the way artillery is depicted is unnecessarily complex, but this is not a major issue. The rules cover an astounded period, and the rules list, or the army list, reflects this. While I do not use these rules to any great extent anymore, they are reasonably playable and complete. Of course, you need to struggle through the terse text, and it's best if someone who knows the rules instructs you on how they're to be used. This is a common failing with many rules, but is a particular issue with WRG rules. One aspect which did slightly puzzle me was who designed and wrote these rules. The rules themselves do not say, although constantly rules refer to we rather than I, so I have to assume more than one person was involved in the design and writing of the rules. Back in 1969, WRG was formed by Phil Barker, Bob O'Brien and Ed Smith. Now, the order of these names, which you can get from Wiki, is probably alphabetically rather than implying someone specific was the main founder or contributor to WRG. It could also imply other things as well, but as the names are sorted alphabetically, I will go with Occam's razor on this particular point. We know that WRG Micro Armor rules were designed by at least two of these gentlemen, as there is a statement which claims two of the designers had World War II experience. It's possible more designers were involved, but I can only confirm two based on the single quotes in the rule. These rules also use we rather than I, so it's possible at least two, if not all three, of the founders, or others that I have no idea of, were involved with the design of both sets of rules. However, while it's possibly not that relevant, one fact we can reasonably be confident of is Phil Barker would have been one of the core designers based on particularly this reprint of the rules. I started this investigation due to an error I made in an earlier video that in terms of who designed the rules. As I know, more than one designer was involved with the Wargame Rules 1685 to 1845 based on the Royal We, but I was really uncertain who they were. This book made me think the other designer may have been John Curry, which is completely incorrect. This is one of the dangers of assumption, and look, I have to admit, possibly it's not that relevant who actually designed the rules, but I always found it an interesting point that the names were never actually listed in the original rules for some bizarre reason. However, in order to achieve or to obtain the final answer to this question, you need to probably speak to the original team in WRG and ask them the question. I cannot confirm all the players involved in designing the rules and their exact involvement. I'm only just guessing. I always wondered why there were no credits on the originally published rules, so there may be a deeper mystery here. It's also possible the answer to the question can be found in the John Curry edited version of the rules. I may even consider buying a copy one day if my curiosity gets too much for me. The WRG Napoleonic rules have a historical significance as being possibly the first really successful set of Napoleonic rules available in the UK and, of course, the old British Empire. In the US, that position probably goes to Empire 2nd Edition, which came out in 1975. I have discovered, while researching this video, that this is the origin of the unique style of basing. 2 figures up front and 2 in the rear on a square or almost square base. I did not realise it went this far back, which I find rather interesting. There was also another set of rules which came out in 1978, which I have minimal information on, which was called First Empire. The First Empire is a bit of a mystery, but as one of the designers wrote an article for a US Wargaming Club magazine back in 1987 called the Midwest Wargamers Association Newsletter, this is clearly a US-based set of rules. However, it does not seem to go anywhere and is more an interesting historical occurrence rather than any kind of historically significant fact. Incidentally, the Midwest Wargames Association newsletter can be purchased today and is filled with interesting articles, although it is a club newsletter, so don't expect anything very polished. WRG's first set of Napoleonic rules came out in January 1971 and was about 20 pages in length, using a simultaneous sequence of play, and was based on the WRG Ancient set of rules. I have to assume the first edition of the WRG Ancient rules. Using a figure scale of 1 in 15, 30 seconds per game turn, including delays, each game turn represented 15 minutes, using simultaneous movement, orders, and generally required an umpire. The rules are available to be downloaded today. The second edition of the Ancient Rules came out in December 1971, so the Napoleonic rules may have been closer to that set of rules. But to the best of my knowledge, the details mentioned already would not really have changed even if that was the case. The 1972 version could have incorporated the changes added to the third and fourth edition of the WRG Ancient Rules if the rules were still being aligned at this point. That's something that I'm not 100% certain of. The only other set of commonly used rules I could find for this period was the TTG rules for the Napoleonic period, originally created for a competition in 1974 and published the following year. I suppose this is one way of playtesting a set of rules. The sequence of play looks surprisingly similar to WRG Ancient 6th edition, or at least the basic structure did. I wonder if there was any crossover. The July 1979 Napoleonic rules, which is what I'm focusing on in this video, came out in between Ancient's 5th edition, 1976, and the 6th edition in 1980. The 5th edition was still an order and simultaneous move system type set of rules, but the 6th edition, while in theory simultaneously, was beginning to regulate game turns and moving towards a sequential system. The Napoleonic set of rules were pure sequential, similar to the World War II and modern set of rules. The WRG Napoleonic rules made a complete break from the previous Ancient set of rules, as well as being a significant rewrite. While you do have to purchase the latest version of the Napoleonic rules, or the WRG Napoleonic rules, the previous versions are available to download for free, and if you read them, you can see something that represents significant development. That is, if you get all the books and read them all. The most obvious one was moving the figure scale for 1 in 15 to 1 in 50 for infantry. There is also a very old set of rules from Donald Featherstone's book printed in 1963. The game system was used in a latter set of rules called Napoleonic Wargames by Turnbridge Wells Wargamers Society. Some pages are available for download and they look like very simple rules, mainly interesting from a historical point of view only. I expect there were lots of club rules, but generally they did not have much future. It takes long-term dedication and effort to get a set of rules to get real traction, and outside the various clubs, these type of rules probably did not become very successful, although they're interesting from a historical point of view or a curiosity point of view. The WRG rules did have good support in the form of army lists. I only wish I could get a copy of the Napoleonic's army list by R.M. Evans, as it looks rather interesting, but from a rules point of view, all you need is the horse and musket army list written by Bruce Cronin. While there is no doubt the WRG set of rules benefited from early works and may have been influenced by other contemporary rules, they represent the bedrock of Napoleonic gaming in the UK and possibly in South Africa, New Zealand, Australia and Canada. In the US we could argue that Empire represented the same equivalent, and I suspect Canada benefited from both rules cultures. I found it astounding that more than 50 years later I can still see gamers using WRG sets of rules, Napoleonics, as they existed in 1979. The state of the art has advanced from those early days, but WRG will always remain one of the keystones in the hobby we pursue to this day. Now let's start reviewing the rules. The most important aspect of any rules is scale, as this affects a host of other factors, such as what type of game you would expect, what type of movement, and to a lesser extent the force mixes you require. The next most important factor is the game system, such as sequence of play, visibility, movement, and fire combat system. This will tell you how historically accurate or otherwise a set of rules is. The actual gameplay tells us how easy or difficult playing a game is. This requires playtesting it, as it cannot be derived from reading the rules. Once you've run a few games, you will quickly determine how playable the sets of rules are, and I personally feel these are quite playable. Learning the rules is a combination of complexity, rules presentation, examples. Simple game systems can be difficult to learn, and complex game systems can be easy to learn based on the way the rules are structured. So while affected by the complexity of the rules, other factors do come into play which need to be considered. The final factor to consider is supporting material, which is required for players to create force mixes, set up a game, and play the game. Many free rules may be very good, but if they lack cheat sheets, equipment lists, army lists, and scenarios, they don't really have much traction. This requires players to make an enormous amount of effort to simply get a game off the ground, and often they just simply won't make the effort. The basing of these rules is typical for the era when looking at 15mm figures, but I found it interesting that there was basing for 6mm figures as well. I never really took much notice of this when I used to use these rules back in the 70s and 80s, but this sort of indicates they're surprisingly advanced. If we specifically look at 15mm figures, the basing and figure scales are well aligned, with a base of 4 infantry figures at a scale of 1 in 50, adopting a similar frontage to a base of 2 cavalry at a scale of 1 in 40. A base is supposed to represent 40 metres, which is 2 ranks of cavalry at 1 metre for the front rank horse, or 3 ranks of light infantry at 60 centimetres for each front rank man. The artillery, or 2 guns, have a frontage of 2 centimetres or 26 metres. We know the minimum gap between artillery was supposed to be 6 metres, so 2 guns could be expected to have a minimum frontage of 18 metres. The British preferred a gap of 10 metres, which gives us something close to the frontage of 26 metres. I expect the British frontage was adopted in the rules, which gives us a surprisingly accurate frontage. I have no idea these rules took so much effort in getting this rather critical issue of frontage correct. The only area I cannot confirm are battalion guns, which I have to assume may have had smaller frontages. If we look at a 1,000 point battle, we can have a force mix of 59 elements, which is a large force mix, which I would estimate would result in a game of at least 4 hours. This is a Prussian army, which includes a lot of raw troops. Other armies may be smaller. This represents a corps-sized formation of about 9,600 men and 14 guns. While this would not allow you to fight any of but the smallest conflicts, it still represents an interesting game. Just a note, Napoleonic troop density did vary a lot, but for the early war, this would be what you would expect to be positioned along a 1 kilometre frontage, or about 10 metres or 10 men per metre. In the latter period of the war, when density increased, this would have been expected to cover about half the distance, and the density would increase to about 20 men per metre. This means the playing area should be 75 centimetres in width, or no more than 3 feet. I'm getting pedantic, but in most cases the front line consisted of 2 lines of troops separated by reasonable distances. In attack, the formation, let's say regiment, was often much deeper than it was wider, and vice versa if you're in defence. This shows a possible defensive deployment based on a Prussian 1813 manual, excluding the artillery. I've never seen anything like this on a playing area in my life when considering WRG gaming. In this case, the frontage is 25 elements, each of 3 centimetres, giving us a playing area frontage of 75 centimetres. When attacking, the frontage would be less. Personally, for a formation of this size, there is too much artillery, yet this is allowed according to the army list. I'm a bit uncertain why this is the case, and maybe an army list issue, but I suspect a player would reduce the artillery and beef up the cavalry. The cavalry often supported the infantry in squadron-sized formations. The ground scale is 1 inch equals 50 paces, or 20 inches per mile, or a scale of 1 in 3,168 for 15mm figures. This is a rather good ground scale to use and is a significant increase over the previous versions of the rules. These rules were really aiming at players commanding corps-sized formations rather than divisions or brigades, and I feel this is a critical factor in their success. The rules indicate the playing area can range from 160 centimetres to 360 centimetres for 15mm figures. Perhaps a 1,000 point game requires 100 centimetres, which is a bit large, but at least is in the ballpark. The depth ranges from 120 to 180 centimetres. If we assume the lesser for our smaller games, we end up with a playing area of 160 centimetres wide and 120 centimetres deep, or 5.5 feet wide by 4 feet deep. This is not a small playing area, but for the period was the norm. Historically, the width should be closer to 4 feet wide by 4 feet deep. But if we are quibbling over details, and there is nothing wrong with 1,000 to 1,500 point games being played on a smaller than recommended playing area. WRG really like the concept of paces, which I normally dislike as it adds extra calculation in any game. However, one good aspect of this system is you can use any base width you like and all distances are adjusted accordingly. If you were to use 4 centimetre wide bases, then an optional front line for a 1,000 point game becomes 90 centimetres with 30 centimetres per flank, which I normally fill with terrain. I must admit I normally use 15 centimetres on a flank rather than 30 centimetre gap, which is not technically correct but suits my portable playing area. This makes for a nice playable playing area. Each game turn represents 30 minutes, which apparently includes wasted time. In the rules it states each pair of play turns represents what can occur in 160 seconds of real time. 30 minutes per game turn is very reasonable, as playing the initial contact Marengo would last 8 game turns in this case, which makes it a reasonable game. The French counterattack would be much shorter at 3 game turns, or about maybe 4. Irrespective of history, a game with a force mix of 50 elements would optimally be no longer than 8 game turns in length. Otherwise the game will take too long for a comfortable day length game. The rules do have a rather complex terrain setup system, which I remember as being rather painful to go through. While it works and does give you a game, I would suggest a system based on an actual battlefield, or perhaps agree how many terrain pieces should be deployed, and one player deploys and the other selects the side. Terrain setup is always hard, as you don't want to spend too much time doing it, yet you don't want to play on a billiard table. You also need to avoid terrain which gives someone a major advantage. For the period these rules were published, the terrain setup system was quite reasonable. The sequence of play is a classically simple IGUYU sequential system, I go, you go sequential system. Unlike more modern rules, shooting and melee occurs before movement. Again, during the period this was common, but these days designers have determined playing is more fun when you move and then shoot and fight. However, there is nothing wrong with a system where melee and shooting occurs in the following game turn. As you would expect in a core side game, the CNC is a corps commander or equivalent, and there are divisional, brigade, sub-commanders. I'd guess 3 sub-commanders and 1 CNC is what a typical force mix would deploy, giving each sub-commander 4 to 5 units to command. The actual command effects are run through or are simulated through the reaction tests. A general is considered to be in control of a unit, which means he is with the unit or within 30 centimetres of it, directly controlling it, or within 60 centimetres if it's indirectly controlling it. When a unit is under control, either direct or indirect, it gains a bunch of reaction test modifiers, all positive. If not under control of any commander, they suffer negative reaction test modifiers. The system is conceptually simple. There are many other effects in terms of combat, but the primary effect is affecting the reaction die rolls. One very good aspect of the rules is no orders. There are no orders which need to be written down. This was a major advance in terms of playability. The downside of no orders was the use of a rather complex reaction test system. It may seem daunting at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's not really a major impediment. The only issue is these type of reaction tests are designed to stop players from doing what they want, and designers these days have realised it's better to restrict how many things a player can do rather than stopping them doing stuff. The main effects of removing reaction testing is speeding up gameplay. Each time you want to do something and then spin a dice and discover you can't do it, basically means you've wasted time. I expect this is why WRG PIP system came into being. On the other hand, reaction tests are a lot better than order writing, so I'm not being particularly negative. This is simply a step in the progression to what we see generally today in most rules. Let's look at an example. In this case, to conduct a charge, each player spins a d6 and the result must exceed the modified total of what is called reaction points. As you can see, charging into a square is not easy and charging foot into buildings not far off that. If charging in the front of infantry in line or column you are not disordered, it will generally happen. You can see the effect of a general here. If the general does not control a unit and you spin a 1, you cannot charge home. The rules divide troops into regular and irregular, and they have 4 morale classes in each group. In most armies, the only irregulars you'll possess are levies, which tend to be artillery crews. Morale has a hand-to-hand effect, which with raw and levy getting a -2 modifier, which is not good. Actually, the enemy gets a +2 when facing this troop type, to be technically accurate. Elite gets a +1 when charging, and veterans get a +1 when fighting anything except veterans. Morale also has an effect on reaction tests, with elite and veterans getting good modifiers and raw and levy getting pretty bad modifiers. Once raw is routing, it's pretty hard to rally them, for example. The rules support 4 troop states: steady, unsteady, disordered and shaken. Disordered and shaken are the key bad troop states to avoid. Disorder rules are the bulk of the troop state rules, with disorder ending when the cause is removed, and the other when in disorder ending when the unit rallies, which means taking a reaction test. Shaken troops also have 2 classes, one which requires a rally to recover, and the second is incurable. Let's look at movement, and the question I need to ask myself, where should I start? These rules dedicate a lot of pages to movement. While it's true some form of this includes formation changes and moving across unusual terrain, there is a surprising amount of restrictions and guidelines for charging, counter-charging, feint charging, evading, routes and pursuits. It must be remembered these rules were removing the restriction of orders and trying to replace them with rules, a lot of rules. If you allow every unit to move freely every game turn, you do not end up with anything that resembles reality at the scales used in these rules. You need to restrict what players can do using reaction tests and lots of movement rules. This was not unusual in other sets of rules and was the state of the art in its day. One interesting point is how mobile a game would be expected to be. Using 15mm figures, a line infantry could move 150 paces or 7.5 centimetres per game turn without shooting, 5 centimetres if shooting. A playing area is typically 120 centimetres deep, so a foot infantry that wishes to move half the depth of a playing area would spend between 8 and 12 game turns doing so. This depends obviously on opposition, which I would assume would exist. As a typical 50 element per side game could be expected to take 1 hour to execute 3 game turns with experienced players, and longer if not experienced, its clear setup is critical because there is not much movement. The rules support all the formations which Napoleonic players love, especially square. There is a major focus on skirmishing, which is a nice bit of accuracy. We can argue if the way they approached this was optimal, but you really saw the difference between the skirmishing forces of the early French compared with the early coalition nations using these rules. The fire combat system uses the game system of including all possible fire combat options and values in a single table. This is common with rules which possess few troop types or weapons, but these rules provide an extraordinary level of detail in its fire combat system, particularly table. As the rules cover such an extraordinarily long period, this is probably to be expected, but does add a little bit of complexity. Let's look at an example. We first identify the shooter type. Let's say mass musket fire by steady regular infantry. Then we identify the range, which in this case has a long and short range. Long range is 200 paces or 10 centimetres for 15mm, and short is 100 paces or 5 centimetres for 15mm. Then we have to identify a target class, which could be rapid, dense, normal, clump, dispersed, covered, protected. If firing at normal, the possible results are 4, 5H and 6HH, which means on a roll of 4 or 5, using a D6 dice, we achieve a single hit, and on a 6, a double hit. Each hit requires a figure to be removed, with some target classes requiring a second die roll for effect, such as if firing at artillery. The system is simple, but when you first view the chart, it can be daunting. Experience does assist. Once a unit has suffered a hit from fire combat, that unit needs to take a reaction test. Generally, unless you have suffered a large number of hits, you will pass. Raw troops will have the worst of it, with an auto fail on a 1 to 3, assuming one hit was received. The close combat or hand-to-hand combat system uses a much simpler chart, with a list of modifiers which are used to determine if either side has an advantage or not. As you can see here, if neither has an advantage, mounted against foot has a result of 4, 5, 6, HHH, and foot against mounted 6H. As you can see here, foot is better have some advantage when meeting mounted. Even in this case, mounted get a double hit on a 6, while infantry on a single hit of 5 or 6. Of course, the real issue is getting the mounted to charge into combat, which is where the power of square formation comes to the fore. While we've seen how casualties are inflicted in hand-to-hand, the real effect is if you've lost the close combat, which means you've suffered more casualties, that's what you're looking for. That unit then takes a reaction test, starting with a factor of 6, which means an auto-fail. If veterans, then they're -1, and if charging, -1 or -4. But basically, having more hits inflicted on you than you inflict on the enemy is normally a very, very bad thing. There is no automatic loss in the game. Each player keeps on fighting until one concedes. If neither concedes, then victory is determined by casualties inflicted and objectives held. If one side has 10% or more than the other, that player has won. The one point you need to understand is not much occurs during a game, and each game turn represents a very small slice of activity, so this is expected. As a result, it would be difficult to play a game to some form of obvious conclusion within a reasonable time frame, assuming each player suffers some reaction test, unless each player suffers some kind of a reaction test initiating catastrophe. At this timescale, this is not unusual. Now let's look at the rules layout. While many people complain of the unusual wording of WRG rules, I rarely had any issues here. Apart from a very few unusually worded rules, most of the rules are clear and complete. A lot of work went into creating these rules, and the results do show. The rules do have a lot of what I call commentary, which is good when learning the rules, but can make referencing the rules more difficult. The biggest issue is lack of cross-referencing, which is something all WRG rules have. Trying to find that all-important rule can be difficult, but once again I must admit the layout of these rules is such that most relevant rules are contained into a single chapter. Once you remember that a rule exists in the reaction test section rather than, let's say, fire combat section, you can quickly find it if required. The rules do have a lot of what I call special rules. However, most of these are placed where they need to go. So if you want to find a rule which applies to, let's say, elephants in close combat, you can generally find them. However, these rules do have a lot of special rules, and if using unusual troop types, you need to carefully study those troop types before a game. Otherwise, you'll waste a lot of time trying to find those rules, or you won't use your special troop types correctly. While not specifically a special rule, it's sometimes hard to get an idea of some basic game concepts, such as with raw troops. To find the overall effect of raw troops, you need to jump around a bit between reaction tests, fire combat, etc. sections. Artillery is a bit like this as well. Why I'm worrying about the crews and what is the effect of raw or levy crew on my artillery is a classic example. This is only an issue if you need to understand a troop type to plan your tactics. When playing a game, most of these questions are answered organically, but it does cause a new player to be rather cautious when playing with these rules. They don't really know what you can do. The amount of record keeping on the playing area is minimal, which is a major plus. This does require you to have a single figure base in your unit so you can take casualties. If you do not possess them, then you do need strength point markers to indicate hits. Troop order markers are also required, but generally the playing area is kept clear of markers. This set of rules will not hurt your head. in terms of calculating. Apart from some minor calculating, when you need to add up three numbers together, there is no need to be able to do long division in your head. This is, again, a major plus. While this is a D6 dice game, it's not an exercise in mass dice rolling, although if you have a 4-element line infantry shooting and another 4-element line infantry, both players will probably spin 4d6 in that case. These rules, for their time, had a lot of supporting material. This was mainly created by other peoples or companies, but I know of at least 2 sets of army lists. However, in terms of scenarios, I've not seen much of these. These are very much a points-based competition set of rules and not a set of rules that were really used or designed for historical simulations. This shows an example of an Austrian army list. The point system is not simple, but this makes it easy as possible to create an army. This only shows the infantry section. As you can see, in this case, the Austrians must field 10 battalions of line infantry, each consisting of 16 figures or 4 elements. 4 figures can skirmish. This costs 520 points, and in a 1,000 point game has expended over half your points. The use of army lists is important as large amounts of artillery will make for a very poor game. These army lists contains more artillery than I would normally be comfortable with, but at least the Austrians' ability to field a line of artillery wheel against wheel is limited, which is not the case if you don't use army lists. In conclusion, these rules are surprisingly good and continue to be played today. The only issue with this is some games between experienced players do end up being rather boring, with each trying to force an unfavourable reaction test in the enemy via the use of long-range artillery fire. This is especially an issue if too much artillery is fielded. Personally, I would prefer uneven games, but at 5 to 7.5 centimetres a move for infantry, this would require very long games indeed, so it's not really viable. My advice is to keep the points down to competition levels, 1,000 points or a maximum of 1,500 points, and you'll have an enjoyable game on a reasonable playing area. I personally have never tried games which involved multiple commands, but I've seen many being played. It goes without question, if you are having team games, this game system may work very well, but I suspect each pair of players will be engaged in very separate games. If you wish to reproduce a multi-core conflict or battle with just 2 players, these rules are not really optimal. The scale simply does not allow it. It's difficult to find truly comparable sets of rules. In the day, these rules were similar to other commonly used in the UK, but were certainly not similar to Empire from the US. On the other hand, I am certain these rules have formed a bedrock for most subsequent rules, so I suppose they are similar to most other rules to an extent, or at least many of the ideas are present in even modern rules. Specifically, these rules use the same scale as Elan, the field of battle, with Elan being the closest to WRG. One point that I wish to re-mention, the designers did a very detailed job concerning element frontages. The infantry and cavalry frontages mesh in with most common understanding of standard frontages of these troop types. Even the artillery, which are placed on unusually narrow bases, meshes in with the 2-gun scale. I personally would have kept the base width the same and simply made the element scale to 3 guns per element, but then it would be hard to depict howitzers, and guns were often used in pairs, so the designer's choice was probably optimal. A lot of thought has gone into these rules. The only real issue with these rules are the use of game systems which have not been found to be optimal. The plethora of reaction tests, the detailed and prescriptive manner movement is conducted, and many game functions being suboptimal. However, in defense of the rules, what was created was a quantum leap towards compared with other rules, either in terms of improved game system elements such as the removal of order and its historical accuracy such as levy drivers for artillery. Apart from reformatting it, possibly converting the base width to a standard 15mm 4cm wide, which would be trivial as to be really not necessary, creating cross-referencing and possibly example guides, there is little you could do to these rules to make them better. For experienced players, none of these suggestions are necessary, but possibly for new players may be useful. These are old rules and are such not really available, but some information about the rules can be found in the site that you can see at the top, and it's possible to download the rules from the internet using the link below. Second-hand copies of the rules may also be available, and you can also still get a version from Lulu. So in some ways these rules probably are still available in some way, shape or form. And so we come to an end of episode 5 of my video series on rules reviews, in this case providing an overview of the WRG Wargame rules 1685 to 1845. Even if you've never used these rules in a game, I would recommend you getting a copy. It's filled with interesting concepts and a surprising level of historical detail. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.